Hi, welcome back to Tiny Garage Fabrication. Today we're working on the Datsun 620. We're going to take a break from the suspension work. We're going to focus on the engine this episode. Going to get it off the ground, put it on an engine stand, go through it, probably pull the intake, the valve cover, the oil pan, take a look at the bearings, take a look at the clearances, see if anything appears messed up. I'm pretty sure this is a freshly rebuilt motor, and it doesn't seem like it had almost any road time since the vehicle got parked and abandoned. So that's good news for me. Hopefully everything checks out. Alright, enough chit chat. Let's turn to. Alright, it's time to break some eggs so I can make one beautiful omelet. First thing to go is the transmission. Had to fight it a little bit. The dowel pins were sticking pretty good, as well as the shim plate. It was stuck on. There was a bunch of extra bolts I didn't know about at first. Got them off. Whatever. Next, take a look at the clutch and pressure plate. Turns out the pressure plate was pretty burnt. I think somebody didn't know how to drive a manual. I don't know who that somebody was because this truck was abandoned and I will never know. Clutch worn pretty good. The flywheel looks okay. I think it will survive. I had to go buy another new engine stand. I'm up to like 5 of these things now because I can't finish projects and I just have engines sitting on stands. Hopefully this one will actually come off the stand someday. This alternator bracket was super janky. I don't know what happened to it. Apparently L-series alternator brackets are hard to find, so this is what I get. Yeah, this intake was a pain to get off, not only because it's a cross-flow head, so the intake and exhaust share the same studs and nuts, but it seems like every nut washer stud combo was a different length, required a different wrench or deep well socket or 6-point or 12-point or shallow socket. It took forever. It pissed me off. It was frustrating, but it's off and it may never go back on again. I don't know. Of course, the 3 bolts that hold my exhaust itself on are broken. And I finally get my first look here. There's a bunch of yellow and green crystals growing in every exhaust port, as well as some green and black fluid on the back of the intake valves. That kind of tells me I've got a blown head gasket. At a minimum, a blown head gasket. Bottom end on this thing looked amazing. All of the rods and bearings felt great. I don't think there's any damage down there, so I just went ahead and moved on. And let's get the rest of this thing taken apart. Got to get that head off. I feel like something's going to go wrong in that head. I didn't worry about marking any of the timing stuff because I'm going to be resetting it all from scratch. And I immediately ran across the problem. As soon as I put the hex on this, I could tell that the bolt was broken. Completely broken, sheared off right where the threads start. So I clearly am going to have some head gasket issues. That's how I feel about it. Alright, let's get this thing off and see what's going on. Right here it's pretty clear. You can see exactly where the issue was. Oil and coolant definitely leaking from around where there was no clamping pressure. And what's really strange is the threaded portion came out by hand. It was not tight at all. I don't know how a bolt breaks and the threads aren't even tight. It happened. It sucked. I got a new bolt. I think it was about $15 shipped to my house. Good to go. Now it's time for basically a top end rebuild. I want to go through this head because of all the crystals and the stuff that were in there. I want to pull out all the valves, clean those all up. Now this is an A87 head, and I'm quite surprised to see that it is a closed chamber design or a peanut style combustion chamber. Normally these were all open heads. All this means is I get a little bit more compression, like maybe half a point, whatever. And it also has the through cam oiling, which I'm pretty excited about. As I mentioned on the studs that hold the exhaust and intake on, they're just wrecked, so new ones will be going in. My due diligence, I checked the head for flatness with a straight edge and a feeler gauge, and this thing was perfect to my complete surprise. Now, the number 2 cylinder, the valves, both of them had this incredibly hard, incredibly thick crud on it, and I literally had to get a hammer and a chisel to break it off of there. So that's what I'm doing now. I'll get the rest of this thing cleaned up and get these valve springs and valves out of here. Here's what some of that crud looked like that came out of the ports. I go ahead and clean up the surface really well. Hit it with a file and then a stone just to make sure it's good and flat so that when I do bolt on intake and exhaust that it mounts up well with no leaks. This is my first time using this style of valve spring compressor. Worked pretty good. It was about 15 bucks from Harbor Freight, and the only thing I needed to do was add a little clamp to keep the 2 sides from coming off, but it worked out just fine. These valves are disgusting. Let me illustrate what I'm doing here if you've never taken a head apart before. The valve itself has little grooves in it, and these little grooves keep these small keepers that go and they keep the retainer from coming off the top. So 2 little like half cone things, and the retainer goes into them and it can't come off the top, and that's what allows the spring to push up on the valve. Now we can take a look inside the runners. You can see some of that just gross, all that crystal-y stuff that's in there. All that's going to be coming out. We'll get it out here in a little bit. Now this heat shield thing will not be used, so I wanted to take it off. Just go ahead and cut that off. Cut off the studs that were broken. Drill all these out so I'll be able to put an exhaust back on this thing later. Now I want to gasket match the head. The ports on the head were only 1.25 inches and the gaskets were 1.5 inches. So as you can see, I threw down some die cam, scribed a line, and now we'll get out a bit on the air grinder, go ahead and grind those out rough, and then come back with some sandpaper rolls and smooth them out. And now our port match to 1.5 inches. I don't think I'll get any performance out of it, but I just wanted to do it. Throw this thing in the parts washer, get some of those aluminum shavings and some of that old crud out of there, as well as get my stiff bristle brush inside those ports to get all that crud and crystals out of there. Now we'll take this thing outside, throw it on the bench, mask it off really well, lay down some primer, and then a coat of aluminum colored paint. Ended up being a little bit more silvery and bright than I wanted it to be, but I know from experience that this paint does dull and kind of end up turning kind of a bronzish gold color with enough heat. These disgusting valves, hit them with the wire wheel on the bench grinder. And they're looking pretty alright now. Now it's time to rebuild the head. I want to show you this with the valve seals. I cut a piece of a straw from Chick-fil-A, heated it up a little bit so it'll slide over the top of the valve stem, That way the seal can glide over it without getting caught on the two lips and possibly snagging or cutting the seal. Now I'm just going ahead and assembling everything out of the bags that I bagged them up with originally. The order of it goes, valve goes in the head, then the valve seal, then the valve springs, then use the valve compressor to get the valve retainer on, and then put the valve retainer keepers in, and then I put in the rocker arm and the rocker arm retainer. And there we go. Next up, I'm using some of the solvent from my solvent tank on the engine just to get some of the good heavy grease off of there, and follow it up with some regular degreaser, and then shoot it with some brake clean just to get it good and clean. Then it's onto the manual work with wire brushes and scrapers and sandpaper just to get all the loose, flaky, disgusting stuff off of there. Some compressed air, another round of brake clean, and we're ready to mask it up so that we can shoot some primer and then some color. Now the color I used for this is Pontiac Blue. It's quite similar to the original old school Datsun kind of light teal blue. It's close enough, comes in a spray can, it was available, so I used it. I don't care what the Datsun purists say, I think it looks great. Next up was the freeze plugs or expansion plugs. I smashed these out with the air hammer and pulled them out with vice grips, so that way I can put in some brand new ones in a slightly better color. Also, it turns out the inside of this thing was disgusting. I believe somebody tried to use a head gasket repair, the type that you put in the coolant, and it all pooled up here on the back left side of the engine. Just tons of this crud. A little bit of powder coat here, the valve cover and some of the accessories. If you'd like to see exactly how to powder coat that, there's a link up here in the corner. Just click that, see how I powder coated the valve cover. Brass freeze plugs look way better in that blue block, nice and shiny. Finally, engine assembly. Fresh head gasket, put number 1 top dead center. Put the head on, get the cam gear, also number 1 top dead center. Find out all your timing marks. Now I've marked the chain. I selected the pin there, 42 pins away. I marked the pin there so I know where it needs to go onto the crank sprocket, and then align properly on the cam sprocket. 42 links away is how the L18 needs to be. Followed up with my cam chain guides and tensioner. And finally throw these head bolts in, including that one brand new one that I got. Put them in sequence. Torque them 3 steps, 20 pounds, 40 pounds, 60 pounds, and it's good to go. Next up is to torque the cam gear retainer. It needs to go to 110 pounds, so I did that in 2 steps. The cam itself has 2 little square pawls on it that you can grab it with pliers or a large wrench, and you can use that to help keep it from turning. And finally slide that freshly powder coated valve cover on and just admire it. Well, that's as far as I can go on the engine today. It's starting to take shape, starting to look not too terribly bad, I think. The reason I'm not going to go any farther is hardware. I'm going to clean it all up and make it look a lot better than it does now. Just go ahead and leave a comment and let me know what you think of the engine so far. I think it looks pretty good, and it's only going to look better as I get more of the hardware cleaned up and put on and get this thing fully assembled. So stick around for way more Datsun content. There will be a lot more powder coating content and a lot more tips and tricks, including the process I'm going to use to get all the bolts cleaned up and looking a lot better. That's a pretty cool process. Subscribe, like, comment, share. Thanks for hanging out with me today.
Stay safe out there. Thanks, everybody.